Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010. In this video, I'll be going over The Self by George Herbert Mead. So this is the next reading in part one of our book, 4 fundamental questions. The first fundamental question is, who or what am I? In the previous reading, it was by David Hume, who's very similar to the Buddhists. He says there is no self. There is no simple substance that stays the same with itself from one moment to the next. There are unconnected sense perceptions and emotions and thoughts, and the idea that they're somehow united by an underlying self is just a grammatical fiction. That is what David Hume says. So George Herbert Mead agrees with Hume that the self is a byproduct of language. So in some sense, he agrees that it's a grammatical fiction, but in another sense, he rejects Hume, not by name, but he rejects the idea that there is no self, no unified self that can continue for more than a single instant. He does believe in a self, not an eternal soul like Plato and the Hindus and René Descartes. For Descartes, the soul is not eternal. It's created at a certain point, but then it's immortal, does not die. Mead leaves that as an open question as far as the immortality of the soul, but he does say clearly that the self emerges from social interaction. But once the self develops from interacting with other people in society, and that is contingent on symbolic language. So I'll be going over the details of this, but humans have the capacity for symbolic language, which enables us to communicate with each other in societies. And as we interact with each other, that creates the self. But once the self is created through this interaction, Mead will say, for example, on page 112, right in the middle, the first sentence in that middle paragraph, we can distinguish very definitely between the self and the body. The body can be there and can operate in a very intelligent fashion without there being a self involved in this experience. The self has the characteristic that it is an object to itself. And that characteristic distinguishes it from other objects and from the body. So what does he mean by the self has the characteristic that it is an object to itself? An object is, each of us is our own subject. We have a subjective opinion. That's how we perceive the world. How each of us perceives the world is our own subjective perspective of the world. And the things that we perceive are objects. So how does the self become an object? How does the subject become an object? How do you get out of yourself and look back at yourself as an object? Mead will say it's only through social interaction. You see yourself through the eyes of other people when you communicate with them. That's an issue for me, for example, teaching this YouTube class, because usually every other time I've taught this book, it's in front of 25 people, and I can interact. I can see if people are confused, if they're falling asleep. With this, I'm kind of having a conversation with an imaginary audience. I know my class, and I've introduced myself to everybody, but so we'll get into it. Mead even talks about, well, what happens when you're alone? Is there still a self if you have no one to communicate with? He'll say, yeah, you can communicate with yourself. But to get that self going, you first require interaction with other people. Once you've developed a self, then you can maintain it in solitary confinement by talking to yourself. But, all right, so that's the crux of his message in this reading. And it's important to focus in on his idea that the self requires the existence of symbolic language. He does not believe in the eternal ideas imprinted on the soul. For Plato, each of us is born with a soul that's imprinted with all of the absolute ideas that create the material world. One way that we'll see later, Sartre, he describes Plato's theory of the eternal ideas as these are ideas in the mind of God understood as a manufacturer. God knows what he wants to do when he creates a tree. He's got an idea of a tree in the divine mind, and then the many trees that are created in the material world are imperfect copies of that absolute idea of a tree. And every other thing that exists or that you can possibly experience can be traced back to one of these absolute ideas, and all of them, for Plato, are combined in the idea of the good. So Mead does not believe in that theory, but he does believe that a self can emerge from the process of symbolic language. And that you can see at the top of page 114. The importance of what we term communication lies in the fact that it provides a form of behavior in which the organism or the individual may become an object to himself. So the self is the object that is an object to itself. And it's communication that provides that possibility. So continuing on the top of page 114, it is that sort of communication which we have been discussing, not communication in the sense of the cluck of the hen to the chickens or the bark of a wolf to the pack, but communication in the sense of significant symbols. Communication which is directed not only to others but also to the individual himself. So far as that type of communication is a part of behavior, it at least introduces the self. So symbolic communication. And this is related to Plato's theory of ideas. I know it was Nietzsche who said, I don't know if he was the first one to make this argument, but he said Plato's theory of these absolute ideas is an accidental byproduct of symbolic language. And so for Nietzsche, he said, you have to communicate with each other. Speed of communication is essential for survival. If you had to create a new word for every individual wolf that you might see lurking in the forest, then if a wolf were to come in and grab a child and run off with a child, you'd have to make up a new word for each event in that situation, and that communication process would be so slow, the wolf would be gone, and the survival of the tribe would be endangered. So if you can come up with one word that signifies a lot of different things, that gives you the rapidity of communication that provides survival value. So you can say wolf, everyone looks, they know what's going on, somebody can save the child. Or if the example Nietzsche used was about a leaf. We need to communicate about leaves on trees. If you had to give an individual word for each particular leaf, communication would be impossible. So we average over all the differences of all the individual leaves, no two of which are the same, and we come up with one word, leaf. So Nietzsche said, Plato then had the idea that there's one word, leaf, that symbolizes all of the other leaves. That word, leaf, represents an absolute idea, leaf, all of which are contained in the idea of the good. Or as Sartre explains how that opinion developed, each of those ideas is the idea in the mind of God. So God had the idea of a perfect leaf, and then the many leaves emanate from that. And humans, having reason, because all of these ideas are imprinted on our soul, we have that idea of the perfect leaf imprinted on our soul, and symbolic language is a reflection of all of those ideas, which are the eternal properties of the soul. So the fact that the self emerges from symbolic language isn't necessarily against what Plato would say, and this is going to be pertinent for our discussion questions, because Plato would say, yeah, humans are the only ones who have language. René Descartes made that was his primary proof of the existence of the rational soul. Animals don't have symbolic language. If they had reason, they would figure out how to communicate with us by tapping their hooves on the ground in some kind of Morse code or something, but they never do, because they lack reason. So reason is connected with these absolute ideas. language is a reflection of the absolute ideas imprinted on the soul. That's what Plato and Descartes would say. Mead seems to be saying, rather, that the idea of a self emerges from language. So he thinks language just emerged somehow through the process of Darwinian evolution, and that gave rise to the concept of a self, because through this symbolic language we can communicate with each other, and we can see each other I can see myself through the eyes of other people when I'm talking with them, as this symbolic communication is going on. I reflect on what I'm saying. I hear what I'm saying to the other person, so there's two audiences, the person I'm talking to and myself. I start to hear what I'm saying, then I critique what I'm saying as I'm saying it. So the linguistic relationship is the essence of the self for Mead. But once that self emerges, he gives it an independence and a unity, a unified self that furthermore reflects all of the different roles in the society in which that self emerged. All right, so that's the basic idea Mead is trying to get across. So let me go to these discussion questions on page 119. Compare Mead's view to Hume's. Which view do you think is better argued? Explain. So Mead isn't that much different than Hume. They both reject the idea of eternal ideas imprinted on a soul, although Mead is less insistent on denying the existence of this spiritual self than Hume. He even leaves it as an open question. If you look on page 114, the second paragraph, such a self is not, I would say, primarily the physiological organism. The physiological organism is essential to it, but we are at least able to think of a self without it. Persons who believe in immortality or believe in ghosts or in the possibility of the self leaving the body assume a self which is quite distinguishable from the body. How successfully they can hold these conceptions is an open question, but we do, as a fact, separate the self and the organism. So he's saying it's an open question. Maybe there is a soul that can leave the body, but whether there is or isn't, the self does separate itself from the body in which it emerged through this process of symbolic communication with other people in the society. The self, once it emerges from the body, is in some sense separate from the body. You can get so wrapped up in yourself that you become unaware of the world of space and time surrounding you. And I think it's important to point out that he refers to such an experience on page 113. He's referring to near-death experiences. So about a quarter of the way down on the page, he says, Tolstoy, as an officer in the war, gives an account of having pictures of his past experience in the midst of his most intense action. There are also the pictures that flash into a person's mind when he is drowning. In such instances, there is contrast between an experience that is absolutely wound up in outside activity in which the self as an object does not enter, and an activity of memory and imagination in which the self is the principle of object. So he's saying, during these near-death experiences, when a person's entire life flashes before their eyes, that self is so wrapped up in its own memories that it is separate from the material world surrounding it. And he says, is there a soul that's separating from the body? That's an open question, but the experience of the self can be entirely separate from the material body. So that will become important in discussion question 2. I'll read it now because they all relate to each other. He says, how is Mead's view different from rationalist views like Plato and Descartes? Well, Mead's view is different. He doesn't talk about an eternal soul imprinted with absolute ideas, but he's also, in some respect, similar to Plato and especially Descartes when he says that the soul is separate from the body, and that it's the process of symbolic language, rational language, that shows how the soul is different from the body. That is what Descartes says. The main difference between how Descartes came to that conclusion and how Mead came to that conclusion is that Descartes assumes there's a soul already imprinted with ideas, whereas Mead thinks that symbolic language emerges through the process of material evolution, although he does leave open the possibility of a soul that's separate from the body. All right, so continuing on discussion question 1, between Mead and Hume. So Hume believes that nothing stays the same with itself from one moment to the next. No two sense impressions are connected by anything other than these imaginary principles like cause and effect. If you drop a glass and then it shatters, and then you hear the shatter, you could say, well, what caused that glass to shatter? Me dropping it caused it to shatter, or gravity caused it to shatter. Hume would say, all right, I'm an empiricist. I think that reality is rooted to sense impressions. So which sense impression is detecting this causal connection? I see you drop the glass, I see it smash, I hear it smash, but I don't hear or see or smell or taste or touch this causal connection. I can assume that every time you drop a glass it's going to fall and smash, because that's always the way things like that have happened in my past experience, but there's no proof that that must necessarily continue in the future. It probably will, but there's no reason that it could do otherwise, because reason consists of these imaginary connecting principles, which don't have any basis in empirical reality. So Hume says nothing's the same from one moment to the next, and there's no thing that's simple, meaning there's no simple existence that maintains its existence. Everything is a compound of fundamentally unconnected sense perceptions and thoughts and ideas. They seem to be loosely assembled, but they're never really permanently connected into any long existing simple substance. But Mead does believe in this existence of a simple self. If you look on page 116, up at the top, he says, normally within the sort of community as a whole to which we belong, there is a unified self, but that may be broken up. So the self gets outside of its body by seeing itself through the eyes of other people in the community. There is, for Mead, if you look on page 112, he's saying the body is a compound. You can never see the whole of the body at the same time. You can't look at your back, for example. There's no simplicity to the body. I'm going to actually read this middle paragraph on page 112 because it's important. It contains most of the elements in his argument. He says, we can distinguish very definitely between the self and the body. The body can be there and can operate in a very intelligent fashion without there being a self involved in the experience. He's talking about habitual actions like driving a car home. You can get home and forget how you got there because your body just acted automatically through habit. And so there's no self if it's just on autopilot. If your body's on autopilot, the self doesn't have to be involved. So continuing on this paragraph on page 112, the self has the characteristic that it is an object to itself. And that characteristic distinguishes it from other objects and from the body. It is perfectly true that the eye can see the foot, but it does not see the body as a whole. We cannot see our backs. We can feel certain portions of them if we are agile, but we cannot get an experience of our whole body. There are, of course, experiences which are somewhat vague and difficult of location, but the bodily experiences are for us organized about a self. The foot and hand belong to the self. We can see our feet, especially if we look at them from the wrong end of an opera glass, as strange things which we have difficulty in recognizing as our own. The parts of the body are quite distinguishable from the self. We can lose parts of the body without any serious invasion of the self. So the last sentence of this paragraph, the body does not experience itself as a whole in the sense in which the self in some way enters into the experience of the self. So the self experiences itself as a whole. That means it's a simple, unified entity. That is something that Hume rejects. He says at the bottom of page 100, maybe 6 lines from the bottom, there is properly no simplicity in it at one time, nor identity indifferent, whatever natural propension we may have to imagine that simplicity and identity. So the self, it isn't a simple thing, and it doesn't stay identical to itself from moment to moment. That's what Hume says. Whereas Mead is saying that there is a whole self. You can see yourself as a whole, unlike the material body, which you can only see parts of it at any given time. You can experience yourself as a whole. And then he said that on page 112, and then over on 113, he talks about these near-death experiences when you can experience your whole life simultaneously. We also saw while reading Hume that he demands that be the fact, if there is such a thing as a self, that all of your memories would have to be simultaneously and palpably in front of your mind's eye for there to be a self. And that is what people claim to experience during these near-death experiences, and Mead points that out. Okay, so to summarize that first discussion question, compare Mead's view to Hume's, which is better argued, explain. It's up to you whichever you think is better argued, but the main thing is to know what their arguments are, and neither Mead nor Hume grants the existence of an eternal soul that exists prior to the material body and is imprinted with these absolute ideas. That's what Plato believed, and Descartes had a similar perspective. So Mead and Hume reject that, but then they separate because, according to Hume, nothing is fundamentally connected. There is no simple anything. Everything is made of these fleeting impressions and thoughts which don't exist for more than a moment. They cease to exist the moment they begin, and they're not connected by anything other than imaginary, verbal, grammatical principles. If you look on page 106 for David Hume, he says, the whole of this doctrine leads us to a conclusion which is of great importance in the present affair, that all the nice and subtle questions concerning personal identity can never possibly be decided, and are to be regarded rather as grammatical than as philosophical difficulties. Identity depends on the relations of ideas, and these relations produce identity by means of that easy transition they occasion. Easy transition from these fleeting sense impressions. The linguistic concepts of connecting principles like cause and effect allow us to see these very rapidly fleeting sense impressions as being unified by some underlying principle like cause and effect, which becomes the foundation for a self. All right, so let me just finish this paragraph. He says, but as the relations and the easiness of the transition may diminish by insensible degrees, we have no just standard by which we can decide any dispute concerning the time when they acquire or lose a title to the name of identity. All the disputes concerning the identity of connected objects are merely verbal, except so far as the relations of parts give rise to some fiction or imaginary principle of union, as we have already observed. What I have said concerning the first origin and uncertainty of our notion of identity, as applied to the human mind, may be extended with little or no variation to that of simplicity. An object whose different coexistence parts are bound together by a close relation operates upon the imagination after much the same manner as one perfectly simple and indivisible, and requires not a much greater stretch of thought in order to its conception. From this similarity of operation, we attribute a simplicity to it, and feign a principle of union as the support of this simplicity and the center of all the different parts and qualities of the object. So, Hume rejects the idea of simplicity. There is nothing that is indivisible and exists and endures through time. Mead says the self is a simple phenomenon that can exist through time and is independent of the body. So Mead is kind of after the rejection, after Hume's extreme rejection of Plato's theory of absolute ideas and a soul, Mead, the trajectory seems to be back towards that idea, beginning with the materialist assumption that the self begins with a material body, but then language enables us to transcend the body. And maybe it could possibly exist after the body dies. He says that's an open question, but at least while there is a living material body, the self can be separate from it. Okay, discussion question 2. How is Mead's view different from rationalist views like Plato and Descartes? So we've been over that a few times already, comparing Mead to Hume. I think they're clearly different because Mead does not explicitly say that there is a soul, that the self is a soul that will continue to exist after the material body dies. That's the main difference. He doesn't believe, because he doesn't believe in a soul, he also does not believe in these eternal absolute forms of knowledge, these absolute ideas from which the material world emanates. That's what Plato expressed more clearly than Descartes about how the material world emanates from these ideas. In the reading we had, Descartes didn't talk about that. So for Descartes, his 2 proofs for the soul were there's a rational soul. We know that because humans are different than every other living thing, or any kind of a robot, an automaton that you might create that resembles a human. You can tell the difference between a human and the most perfect robot by engaging it in conversation, because reason is an instrument that can adjust to any changing scenario. So humans can communicate with each other meaningfully because we can adapt our conversation to whoever we're talking to. This question is asking, how is Mead different from Plato and Descartes? But I think there's a huge similarity in Plato's proof for the existence of a rational self and for Mead's. They both say the proof of it is, well, Mead says the source of it is in verbal communication, whereas Descartes says the proof of the rational soul, the first proof is in symbolic communication. A robot could talk to you, maybe could even make sounds like a human, but after the conversation continues, you'd realize that the robot just has a limited series of answers from which it can choose, and it doesn't really conform to the reality of the conversation. Whereas for Mead, he said, symbolic language enables us to communicate with other people, then we can perceive ourselves through their eyes and become an object to ourselves, get outside of ourselves and see ourselves through other people's eyes. So they have a different understanding of how symbolic language is related to the self, but that's I think this question could be, how is Mead's view different or similar to the rationalist views like Plato and Descartes? And but at any rate, keeping it as it is, the fundamental difference is Mead does not believe in a soul imprinted with these eternal archetypal forms of knowledge. But as I said at the beginning of this video, Plato could just as easily say symbolic language is a byproduct of the fact that we are eternal souls imprinted with knowledge, eternal absolute ideas, and that the language, which is just each word, each noun, represents some absolute idea. So the noun tree represents the absolute idea of tree. We wouldn't be able to come up with these abstract concepts like the idea of a tree if we weren't already informed by that knowledge. That's what Plato would say. Mead does not say that. He just, however symbolic language emerged through the process of material evolution, once it's developed, it gives rise to the possibility of a self, because it enables us, again, to communicate with other people and to see ourselves through their eyes. That way we get outside of ourselves and we become a part of the world that we're trying to comprehend. So page 120, discussion question 3. Do you think Mead is right about the idea of multiple personalities? Why or why not? So Mead thinks that it's natural for each of us to have multiple personalities. And this is because he thinks the self is a social construct. It emerges as you interact with the people in your society. And he takes that opinion to its logical conclusion, and he says, just as we each have a different relation, the self emerges through social interactions, and we're different as we relate with different people. You're a different person with one group of people than you are with another. That's just a common fact of life. You're different at work than you are at school. You're different at school than you are at home. You're different when you're relating with a child than with an adult. So you're a different person for everyone that you deal with, and there's some aspects of yourself that only emerge when you're talking to yourself, when you're thinking to yourself. That's what Mead says. So I was just looking at this very important paragraph on the bottom of page 113. The individual, the last paragraph on page 113, the individual experiences himself as such, not directly, but only indirectly, from the particular standpoints of other individual members of the same social group, or from the generalized standpoint of the social group as a whole to which he belongs. For he enters his own experience as a self or individual, not directly or immediately, not by becoming a subject to himself, but only insofar as he first becomes an object to himself, just as other individuals are objects to him or in his experience, and he becomes an object to himself only by taking the attitudes of other individuals towards himself within a social environment. So, and then he goes on to explain how that social interaction is only possible with symbolic communication. Doesn't necessarily have to be verbal. Sign language is symbolic communication, but these abstract symbols that represent things that we communicate about, that's required for the existence of a self. If you look at the top of page 116, he says, normally within the sort of community as a whole to which we belong, there is a unified self, but that may be broken up. If you look lower on page 116, he says, disassociations are apt to take place when an event leads to emotional upheavals. That which is separated goes on its own way. The unity and structure of the complete self reflects the unity and structure of the social process as a whole. Continuing down in that paragraph, he says, the structure of the complete self is thus a reflection of the complete social process. The organization and unification of a social group is identical with the organization and unification of any one of the selves arising within the social process in which that group is engaged or which it is carrying on. So if there is a disassociation in the society to which you belong, that will have ramifications in the psychological unity of each of the individuals in the society, because each of those individuals, the psychological structure, he says very boldly, is identical to the social structure of the community in which the self emerged. So if you have different segments of society, if they're not unified in some kind of a organic whole, each part of which is relating with the other in a healthy way, if that state of harmony between the sections of the society doesn't exist, then it's not likely to exist in the individuals who emerge within that society. That opinion will become, I think, a practical explanation of that disassociation within the individual and within society. We'll see that when we read the next reading by Du Bois, who, like Mead, was a fellow student of William James at Harvard University. But Du Bois is speaking on behalf of African Americans. And he says, yeah, I know what it's like to be a member of a society in which one segment is disassociated from the rest, because I'm a member of that disassociated segment, and his attitude about how that affects the evolution of a self, we'll go over that in the next video. I'll go over that. The reading is called Of Our Spiritual Strivings. But so page 115, this is regarding this third discussion question about it's normal to have multiple personalities. The very bottom paragraph on page 115, he says, a multiple personality is in a certain sense normal, as I've just pointed out. There is usually an organization of the whole self with reference to the community to which we belong and the situation in which we find ourselves. So the question is, do you think Mead is right about the idea of multiple personalities? And if you find yourself acting differently and having a different self in relation to different people and different segments of society, then you could say, at least in that basic level, that you do agree. I think most of us do realize we act differently towards different people. So that's all he's really trying to say. And because for him, there's not necessarily a soul, the self is essentially social interaction. If we act differently with different social groups, then we have different selves. So he just emphasizes that social emergence of the self. The final discussion question, to what extent do you think ourselves are shaped by other people? Explain. Now that's a very general question that you could answer without ever having read Mead. So generally I won't include questions like that on the exams, although sometimes I do. But if I do, you should always connect your answer to the reading in which the discussion question, whatever discussion question, whatever reading is attached to, inform your essay by putting it in the context of that reading. Otherwise, if you just say, I don't think we're shaped by other people at all because my cousin Frank says, whatever, okay, that's interesting, perhaps, but it doesn't show me that you've read the reading by Mead. So the next, as I said earlier, the next reading is Of Our Spiritual Strivings by W.E.B. Du Bois, and we will pick it up then.